Three Riot officers crossed the ceremonial rope at Horse Guards Parade, fresh from clearing protesters, drunk on adrenaline, looking for an easy target. They surrounded the Royal Guard, started taunting him, testing him, brandishing their batons like he was just another civilian. They thought ceremony meant weakness. They thought silence meant submission. They thought wrong. Within 30 seconds, all three were disarmed. No punches thrown, no violence used, just precision that took their breath away. And the man in red, still standing at attention, still silent, still perfectly still, as if nothing had happened at all. Before we show you exactly how 30 seconds of perfect discipline dismantled three trained officers, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The afternoon light at Horse Guards Parade had that particular London quality, sharp enough to catch every brass button, soft enough to make the ancient stones look almost alive. It was just past 2 o'clock, and the wide courtyard stretched empty, except for the usual scatter of tourists with their phones and guidebooks, their voices carrying that hushed reverence people get around places where history still breathes. The bells of St. Martin in the Fields had finished their hourly chime, leaving behind the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own footsteps. A light breeze stirred the Union Jack above the archway, carrying with it the faint scent of coffee from nearby cafes, and that peculiar mix of diesel fumes and history that defines central London. Pigeons strutted across the worn cobblestones, completely unbothered by the human activity around them, while somewhere beyond the ceremonial barriers, the city hummed with its endless traffic and conversation and life. At the centre of it all stood Lance Corporal Theo Renner, motionless as carved stone, scarlet tunic pressed to mathematical perfection, bearskin cap towering above his head at the precise angle drilled into him through months of ceremonial training. SA-80 rifle gripped at exactly the right angle, exactly the right position, exactly the way it had been held by thousands of guards before him. To the tourists snapping photos, he looked like what they'd come to see. Living British pageantry, a piece of breathing history standing guard over traditions older than most of their countries. The kind of thing you pose next to for social media. Maybe try to make laugh or flinch, then move on to the next attraction. But there were things about Theo Renner that no tourist guidebook mentioned. Things that wouldn't show up in the carefully posed photographs, or the cheerful commentary from tour guides explaining the changing of the guard. He was 34 years old, with 11 years of real military service behind him. Not just ceremonial duty, real fighting, in real places against real enemies. 3 tours with 45 Commando in Helmand Province, where standing perfectly still for hours wasn't pageantry, but survival. The difference between coming home and not coming home often came down to who could read a situation faster, move more precisely, stay calmer under pressure. The scars hidden beneath his immaculate uniform told stories the tourists would never hear. The one along his left shoulder, from pulling a wounded Marine out of a collapsed compound, while mortars fell around them like deadly rain. The smaller ones across his knuckles from hand-to-hand combat training that had saved his life twice in close-quarters fighting. Once in a Sangin alleyway when his rifle jammed. Once in a nighttime compound raid when stealth mattered more than firepower. The psychological ones that came from watching good men die and learning to carry that weight without letting it show, without letting it slow you down when others depended on your steadiness. He'd learned patience in observation posts, where moving too early meant compromising not just your position, but the lives of every Marine counting on your eyes. He'd learned precision in situations where there was no room for error, no second chances, no margin for anything less than perfect execution under impossible pressure. Standing at ceremonial attention wasn't retirement for Theo. It was another form of service. Different battlefield, same discipline. Different uniform, same steel underneath. The crowd around him shifted and flowed like water, families drifting closer for photos, children pointing up at his towering bearskin with wide eyes, elderly visitors explaining to their grandchildren about tradition and duty, and the things that hold a nation together across centuries. A young American couple was debating whether the guards were real soldiers or just actors. "Look at that posture, Jessica," the man was saying, adjusting his camera angle. "You don't get that kind of bearing from acting classes." An elderly woman in a floral print dress watched Theo with different eyes, the kind that recognized real military discipline when they saw it. She'd lived through the war years, had seen what genuine service looked like. She didn't try to take pictures, just watched with quiet respect. Near the rope barrier, a little boy in a Manchester United jersey was working up the courage to wave, while his older sister rolled her eyes in that way teenagers do when their siblings embarrass them. "Tommy, he's not allowed to wave back," she whispered. "They're trained not to move." None of them noticed when the atmosphere began to change. It started as a sound, boots on stone, but not the measured pace of tourists or the casual shuffle of sightseers. This was different, heavier, more purposeful. The kind of walking that announced itself, demanded attention, carried weight beyond just the physical. 3 men appeared at the edge of the courtyard, and everything about them said they didn't belong in this peaceful scene. They wore the unmistakable gear of Metropolitan Police riot control. Black utility vests marked with impact scuffs, heavy boots designed for crowd dispersal, equipment belts loaded with the tools of urban warfare. Their helmets dangled from their hands or hung by straps from their belts, but everything else about them screamed recent action. Fresh sweat stains, scraped knuckles. The kind of tired satisfaction that comes after a job well done, with maximum force authorized. These weren't tourists taking a break from sightseeing. These were officers fresh from battle, still running on adrenaline and authority. The one in front was built like a rugby forward, broad shoulders, thick neck, the kind of presence that filled a room just by walking into it. Callum Brayshaw had 22 years in riot control, most of them spent teaching London's protesters the difference between peaceful assembly and public disorder. His vest was unzipped at the top, revealing a white t-shirt darkened with sweat, and his movements carried the loose confidence of someone who'd spent the morning reminding people who was really in charge. Beside him walked Jace Linden, younger but no less experienced, spinning his baton in one hand with the casual skill of someone who'd used it professionally just hours earlier. His grin was the kind that never quite reached his eyes, and there was something in his posture that suggested he was still looking for trouble to solve. The third man, Dean Rourke, carried himself differently, quieter, more calculating. His riot shield was slung across his back like a badge of honor, and his eyes swept the courtyard, not with appreciation, but with tactical assessment. The kind of look that evaluated threats, calculated responses, measured resistance. They'd come from Whitehall, where a protest about government spending had turned ugly around noon. Nothing serious, just the usual mix of passionate activists and opportunistic troublemakers that London saw every other week. But it had required the full kit: shields, baton, chemical irritants, and the kind of overwhelming show of force that ended arguments before they could become riots. Bottles had been thrown, windows threatened, the kind of chaos that demanded immediate, decisive action. By all accounts, they'd handled it perfectly. Professional, efficient, no serious injuries, no property damage, no headlines about excessive force. Just 3 experienced officers doing what they were trained to do, restoring order when order was threatened. The adrenaline was still flowing, that post-action energy that came with successful mission completion. The problem was that they were still running on that energy, still high on the authority and adrenaline that came with being the solution to other people's problems. Still wearing the psychological armor that made them feel invincible, untouchable, justified in whatever they chose to do next. And now they found themselves in this quiet courtyard, surrounded by peaceful tourists and ancient traditions, with no outlets for the controlled violence they'd been authorized to use just hours earlier. That's when they noticed the guard. "Look at this," Brayshaw said, his voice carrying across the stone with the kind of authority that made nearby tourists turn to listen. "Standing there like a bloody statue while we're out there doing the real work." Lyndon chuckled, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Bet he's never seen a real riot. Probably thinks policing means standing still and looking pretty for the cameras. Rourke didn't say anything, but his eyes were fixed on Theo with an intensity that felt almost physical. Professional curiosity, maybe. Or professional jealousy. The kind of assessment one soldier gives another, trying to measure what they're really made of underneath all the ceremony and tradition. They approached the rope barrier like they owned it, not with the respectful distance most visitors maintained, but with the casual disregard of people accustomed to crossing lines when their job required it. The crowd around them began to shift unconsciously, that animal instinct that recognizes predators even when they're supposedly on the same side. Brayshaw stopped just outside the ceremonial perimeter and looked Theo up and down with the kind of obvious evaluation that was meant to be noticed. "Real fancy uniform," he said, loud enough for the tourists to hear. "Bet it costs more than my Riot gear. Course, mine's actually functional." A family of German tourists nearby stopped their photography, sensing the change in atmosphere. The elderly woman in the floral dress took a small step backward, her hand tightening on her walking stick. The little boy in the Manchester United jersey moved closer to his sister, suddenly less interested in trying to make the guard smile. Theo didn't react. Couldn't react. That was the protocol. And more importantly, that was his training. In Helmand, he'd learned to read situations long before they became dangerous, to process threats and calculate responses while maintaining whatever cover or position the mission required. Right now, his mission was to stand at ceremonial attention, and that's exactly what he would do until the situation demanded otherwise. But his peripheral vision was tracking all three men, cataloguing their positions, their equipment, their body language. 22 years of Riot experience on the lead man, that meant professional competence, but also institutional arrogance. The baton spinner had nervous energy, the kind that escalated situations instead of de-escalating them. The quiet one was the real threat, though. He was studying Theo like a problem to be solved, and in Theo's experience, that kind of calculation usually preceded action. Lyndon stepped closer to the rope, his baton now hanging loose in his right hand. "You know what I think? I think they put him here because he can't handle real police work. Too pretty for the streets, so they dress him up like a doll and park him where the tourists can take pictures." The crowd was getting uncomfortable now. This wasn't the gentle teasing that guards sometimes endured from visitors trying to get a reaction. This had an edge to it, a professional disrespect that felt almost personal. Phones were coming up, not for cheerful selfies, but to record whatever was about to happen. Brayshaw leaned against the rope barrier, close enough that Theo could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "I bet that rifle isn't even loaded, just for show, right? Wouldn't want the pretty soldier to hurt himself with real ammunition." He reached out and tapped the barrel of Theo's SA-80 with one gloved finger. Once, twice. Testing. That was the line. Not because the weapon was sacred, though it was. Not because the ceremony was inviolate, though it was. But because Theo had learned in places much more dangerous than London's tourist districts that you never let someone test your boundaries without making it clear what those boundaries actually were. Still, he didn't move. Not yet. Because he was still calculating whether this was ignorance or malice, whether these men were looking for entertainment or genuinely trying to provoke an incident. The difference mattered, both for his response and for the report he'd have to write afterward. Rourke stepped around to Theo's left side, his movement casual but purposeful. You ever wonder what he'd do if someone actually challenged him, like really challenged him? Lyndon grinned and stepped over the rope. "Let's find out." The tourists scattered like startled birds. Not running, not yet, but backing away from the rope barrier with the kind of nervous energy that comes when people realize they might be witnessing something they'd rather not see. The German family gathered their children closer. The elderly woman moved toward the archway, but she didn't leave. Something in her wartime experience told her this was important, that what happened next would matter. Brayshaw followed Lyndon across the ceremonial perimeter, his boots scraping against the ancient stones with deliberate disrespect. "Come on then, soldier boy. Show us what all that fancy training is worth." Rourke came last, circling around to Theo's right side with predatory patience. His hand rested on his baton, not threatening yet, but ready. All three men now stood within the sacred space that separated ceremony from the everyday world, their presence a violation of everything the rope represented. Theo stood perfectly still. Not because he was frozen, not because he was afraid, but because he was processing. Three trained officers, all armed, all positioned to attack from different angles. Civilian population scattered, but not gone. Cameras recording, witnesses watching, international incident potential if this went wrong. In Helmand, he'd faced similar odds in a marketplace ambush. 3 insurgents, various weapons, civilians in the line of fire. The key then had been the same as now. Read the situation correctly, respond with exactly the right amount of force, end it quickly and cleanly with minimum collateral damage. The difference was that in Afghanistan, everyone knew they were in a war zone. Here, surrounded by tourists and tradition, the rules were different, more complicated, less forgiving of mistakes. Lyndon drew his baton fully, letting it hang loose in his grip. "What do you think, lads? Reckon he even knows how to use that rifle, or is it just part of the costume?" Brayshaw laughed, but there was no humour in it. "Probably couldn't hit water if he fell out of a boat, not like us. We've got real training, real experience, real authority." He reached for his own baton, metal sliding against leather, with a sound that cut through the courtyard's stillness like a blade. That's when Theo knew this wasn't going to end with words. These men weren't here for conversation or even casual intimidation. They were here to prove something to themselves, to the watching crowd, to whatever professional insecurity had driven them from their successful riot control operation to this confrontation with a ceremonial guard who couldn't fight back. Except they were wrong about that last part. Rourke moved first, not with his baton, but with his body, stepping closer to test Theo's reaction. Nothing to say? No warnings? No, "Please step back, sir"? Theo's breathing stayed steady, but his weight shifted almost imperceptibly, centering over his feet in preparation for movement. His grip on the rifle adjusted by millimeters. Not enough for the cameras to catch, but enough to prepare for action, if action became necessary. "I think he's scared," Lyndon said, raising his baton to shoulder height. "Look at him shaking." Theo wasn't shaking. He was perfectly still, the kind of stillness that comes not from fear, but from absolute focus. In the Marines, they'd called it combat calm. The ability to slow down time, process multiple threats simultaneously, and respond with surgical precision when the moment demanded it. The moment was coming fast. Brayshaw stepped directly in front of Theo, close enough that their faces were less than 2 feet apart. "You want to know what real authority looks like?" He held up his baton, metal gleaming in the afternoon light. "This is what keeps the peace when your pretty parades can't cut it." He didn't swing it, not yet, but the threat was clear, hanging in the air between them like a challenge that couldn't be ignored. Behind the rope barrier, someone in the crowd whispered, "Shouldn't someone stop this?" But no one moved. No one intervened. They were witnessing something they didn't quite understand. A confrontation between different types of service, different ideas of strength, different definitions of what it meant to protect and serve. Theo understood it perfectly. These men saw him as everything they weren't. Ceremonial where they were practical, traditional where they were modern, restrained where they were aggressive. To them, he represented a kind of soldiering that belonged in museums, not on London's streets. They wanted to prove that their way was better, that real strength came from the willingness to use force, not the discipline to avoid it. They were about to learn the difference. Lyndon made the first move. Not an attack, exactly, but a test. He raised his baton and brought it down in a slow arc toward Theo's shoulder, not hard enough to injure, but firm enough to make contact, to prove that the untouchable guard could be touched. The baton never reached its target. Theo's left hand moved with liquid precision, intercepting Lyndon's wrist mid-swing and applying just enough pressure to stop the motion completely. Not violent, not aggressive, just immovable, like trying to strike a mountain. His grip found the exact pressure point that martial artists spend years learning to locate. Not enough to cause lasting damage, but enough to make resistance impossible. For a split second, everything froze. Lyndon stared at his trapped wrist in confusion, his brain trying to process how someone standing perfectly still had moved so fast. Brayshaw's mouth fell open in surprise, the professional confidence draining from his face like water from a broken pipe. Rourke stepped backward involuntarily, suddenly realizing that they might have misjudged their target in ways that could prove very expensive. Then Theo moved. Not with anger, not with the kind of explosive violence they'd been expecting, but with the kind of controlled precision that comes from years of training in situations where mistakes get people killed. His right hand released the rifle, letting it fall into the crook of his left elbow, while his right moved to Lyndon's equipment belt. A single smooth motion, practiced thousands of times, and Lyndon's pepper spray canister was free and flying through the air to land harmlessly behind the rope barrier. Disarmed, in less than 2 seconds. Brayshaw reacted like he'd been trained to. Fast, aggressive, overwhelming force to regain control. He lunged forward with his baton raised, aiming for Theo's ribs in a strike that would have dropped a civilian. Theo wasn't a civilian. He sidestepped with minimal movement, just enough to let Brayshaw's momentum carry him past, then reached out and plucked the baton from his grip as casually as taking a book from a shelf. The weapon spun away across the courtyard, metal ringing against stone. 2 down. 30 seconds hadn't even elapsed. Rourke was the smart one. Instead of charging in like his colleagues, he backed away, reaching for his radio, probably calling for backup or trying to de-escalate before this got any worse. But Theo was already moving toward him, not aggressively, but with the kind of inexorable advance that made resistance seem pointless. His ceremonial boots clicked against the stone in perfect rhythm, his scarlet tunic still immaculate, his bearskin still perfectly aligned. He looked like he was on parade, except for the cold professionalism in his eyes that said this was over, had been over from the moment they'd crossed the rope. Rourke's hand froze on his radio as Theo stepped within arm's reach. No threats, no warnings, no dramatic gestures, just a simple, measured movement that removed the radio from Rourke's grip and set it gently on the ground. Then Theo stepped back to his original position, retrieved his rifle, and resumed his ceremonial stance. Perfect posture, perfect stillness, perfect discipline, as if nothing had happened at all. The courtyard was silent except for the distant hum of London traffic and the rapid breathing of 3 very confused Riot officers. Lyndon was rubbing his wrist, staring at Theo like he'd seen a magic trick he couldn't figure out. Brayshaw was looking around for his baton, his face red with embarrassment and something that might have been respect. Rourke was the first to speak. "How?" he asked quietly. Theo didn't answer. Couldn't answer while on ceremonial duty. But his eyes met Rourke's for just a moment, and in that brief contact was everything the Riot officer needed to understand. This wasn't a museum piece or a tourist attraction. This was a soldier, a real one. The kind who'd learned his trade in places where ceremony was the last thing on anyone's mind. The sound of approaching boots interrupted the moment, heavy, official, moving with purpose. Major Patricia Webb appeared through the main archway, her MOD uniform crisp and commanding, her expression unreadable. She'd been monitoring the situation from the security office, watching through the cameras as three of London's finest made fools of themselves in front of an international audience. She stopped at the rope barrier and surveyed the scene. 3 Riot officers, standing empty-handed in the ceremonial space. Various pieces of equipment scattered across the ancient stones. 1 royal guard, standing perfectly at attention, as if nothing had happened. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone stand a little straighter, "I believe you're lost." Brayshaw found his voice first. "Major, we were just testing," she suggested, "investigating, ensuring that our ceremonial guards are up to your professional standards." The silence stretched uncomfortably. "Names and units," she continued. "Now!" They identified themselves reluctantly, like school children caught misbehaving. Major Webb made notes on a tablet, her stylus clicking against the screen with mechanical precision. "Assault on a ceremonial guard," she said conversationally. "Disruption of a protected site. Unauthorized equipment deployment in a restricted area. That's 3 separate incidents that will require official reports." Lyndon started to protest. "We didn't assault anyone. We were just—" "Were you armed?" she interrupted. "Yes, but—" "Did you enter the ceremonial perimeter without authorization?" "Well, yes, but—" "Did you make physical contact with the guard or his equipment?" Silence. "Then you assaulted a ceremonial guard," she concluded. "The video evidence will support that assessment, I'm sure." She gestured toward the security cameras mounted around the courtyard, their red recording lights blinking steadily. "Excellent coverage from multiple angles should make for very clear documentation." The 3 officers suddenly looked much less confident. Major Webb turned to Theo, who hadn't moved throughout the entire exchange. "Lance Corporal Renner, was your post compromised?" "No, ma'am," Theo replied, his voice steady and professional. "Did you maintain ceremonial protocol throughout the incident?" "Yes, ma'am." "Any equipment damage or safety concerns?" "None, ma'am." She made another note on her tablet. "Very good. Carry on." Then she turned back to the Riot officers, her expression hardening. "You have 2 choices. You can leave quietly, collect your scattered equipment, and we'll handle this through internal channels. Or you can continue standing in a restricted area while I call your superiors and explain why 3 of their officers felt the need to test the combat readiness of a ceremonial guard." The message was clear. They could walk away embarrassed, or they could walk away unemployed. Brayshaw was the first to move, gathering his baton from where it had fallen near the archway. Lyndon followed, rubbing his wrist and avoiding eye contact with the growing crowd of tourists who were beginning to understand what they'd witnessed. Rourke retrieved his radio and looked back at Theo one more time. 30 seconds, he said quietly. "All 3 of us. 30 bloody seconds." Theo didn't respond, but something in his stillness acknowledged the professional recognition. The Riot officers left the way they'd come, their confident swagger replaced by the careful movements of people who'd learned an expensive lesson about assumptions. The crowd watched them go, then turned back to Theo with new understanding in their eyes. The little boy in the Manchester United jersey stepped forward and executed a careful salute. His sister didn't roll her eyes this time. The elderly woman in the floral dress nodded approvingly, recognizing something she'd seen before in other wars, other times when quiet strength had proven more valuable than loud force. An American tourist lowered his camera without taking a picture. "Jesus," he whispered to his wife, "did you see that? He didn't even break a sweat." A young woman with a London accent spoke to her friend. "My dad was army, said the ceremonial blokes are all proper soldiers first, ceremony second. Reckon those Riot lads just learned what that means." The crowd gradually dispersed, but they carried the story with them. Social media would do the rest, not sensational headlines or viral videos, but quiet testimony to something most people never expected to see. Real discipline under real pressure. The kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, but simply stands ready. Theo remained at his post as the afternoon wore on, his uniform immaculate, his posture perfect, his silence complete. The tourists who came after had no idea what had happened in that spot, but some of them sensed something different in the atmosphere, a weight, a gravity that made them lower their voices and show a little more respect. By evening, when the relief guard arrived for the changing ceremony, the incident was already fading into the daily routine of military life. There would be reports to file, statements to give, lessons to be learned and filed away for future reference. But for those who had been there, who had seen 30 seconds of perfect discipline dismantle 3 trained officers without violence or anger or anything more dramatic than professional competence, the memory would last much longer. They had witnessed something rare in the modern world, genuine strength that didn't need to prove itself, authority that came not from weapons or uniforms, but from character, and the kind of quiet courage that holds the line not because it has to, but because that's what service means. Theo Renner went off duty at 1800 hours, filed his incident report in 3 sentences, and went home to his flat in Bermondsey. Tomorrow he would be back at his post, standing guard over traditions and values that some people found old-fashioned, but that had held firm through centuries of change and challenge. The riot officers would be back on the streets too, keeping the peace in their own way, with their own tools and methods. But they would carry with them a new understanding of what real strength looked like when it chose restraint over reaction, discipline over aggression, professional competence over professional pride. And in the quiet corners of London, where police officers gather to share stories and lessons learned, the tale would spread, not as humour or humiliation, but as education. About assumptions, about respect, about the difference between wearing authority and earning it. The Royal Guard who faced down 3 armed officers in 30 seconds and left them standing there, empty-handed and full of questions they'd never thought to ask. So here's what stays with you. Have you ever seen someone so disciplined they made trained officers look like amateurs without throwing a single punch? Do you think there's still a place in our world for that kind of quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself until the moment someone tests it? And if you were in that crowd, watching 3 riot officers try to intimidate a ceremonial guard, what would you have expected to happen? If this story showed you something new about what real discipline looks like, hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, so you never miss these daily stories about the remarkable people behind our oldest traditions. And if you know someone who thinks ceremonial guards are just for tourists, share this with them. Let them see what 30 seconds of perfect restraint really looks like when it's tested by people who should have known better. Your next story is waiting right here on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply stands ready. And when someone finally tests it, the whole world stops to watch.